Hi, everybody. Welcome
Hello.
welcome to Third Space Live. We are a show that offers conversations, ideas, and stories to build mental wellness in our community. And I am your host tonight, Megan Woodruff. And we are here with three amazing guests tonight. And we're here to talk about men's mental health, and particularly from a student perspective, which I'm really excited to dive into tonight because I know that it's a unique time for students. I want to introduce Will, Evan, and Alex, who are with us tonight. Hi, everybody.
How's it going?
Good, thank you. Good. So happy that we were able to coordinate and get you guys on tonight. All three of these gentlemen are either students or alum of UBC and UBCO. So we are closely connected that way. And I'm just excited to hear your guys' perspective around what it's like to be a guy right now, and or someone who identifies as a guy right now, and like what it's like to be a young person too. So I know that you guys are all willing to speak on these topics tonight, and I just want to say thank you so much for hopping on here and being able to share these things, because I know that we have people who are watching who are going to be able to relate, and this stuff is really going to help them. So to kick us off, why don't I just throw it out there? What's it like to be a guy right now? What is it like to be a young person right now?
Those are really broad open-ended questions, obviously. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is being in groups of young people. There is a almost tenuous relationship a lot of the time with public perceptions of masculinity. A lot of kind of inconsistencies with public perceptions of masculinity. And it's a very, very complicated subject to talk about what it means to be a man in 2020, what it means to be masculine in 2020, and even like what masculinity fundamentally is, apart from what it's taught to be. And there are a lot of different schools of thought on that right now. And as men, young men in 2020, we're placed kind of smack dab in the middle of it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can appreciate that. And I know that it's not, just a one sentence answer, and that it's different for everybody. And it is a broad question, but it's broad on purpose because I want you to have the freedom to answer within it however that question lands for you. So, Evan or Alex, you had said that it is complex, and it is a broad question, but if I were to circle back, what is it like for you right now?
It's so difficult to answer that in like concisely, like what's it like to be a man. I think there is, for me, it's a toss up between understanding the privilege I have as a male identifying individual who passes for male, and trying to navigate healthy and unhealthy standards of masculinity. And so it's saying, I have a responsibility as a privileged person to, make room for people who have less privilege than I do, and also to address the issues that underlie, the classic toxic masculinity, and to make sure that I am being what I believe is the best man that I can be within the kind of the social context of masculinity still.
Mm-hmm. And how would you define that?
That's a great question. It's difficult to, I think, say what a man should be. I don't personally think I have the authority to say that. But I know certainly the negative patterns and associations that masculinity carry with them in 2020. When I was in my first year of university, I did a research project on hegemonic masculinity and the effects that it has on men. And traditionally male traits like stoicism and self-sufficiency.
Self-reliance.
Yeah, self-reliance, exactly. There are these things that are deeply ingrained into masculinity in Western culture, certainly, and they can produce negative impacts on both the mental well-being of men and on the actions of men. I think that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention estimated that male suicide rates in 2016 were, I think, 350% higher than female ones in the United States. And so obviously that there are issues in the way that men deal with emotion, the way that men are taught to deal with emotion, and the access they have to emotional support.
Mm-hmm.
We have, I should say.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I think about the responsibility when we say, okay, we're all responsible for our own health, or we're all responsible for our own well-being. And if we don't advocate for ourselves, yes, if we're privileged, we have people around us who can support us and who can help us. And I'm a woman, someone who identifies as female. And so I thought it was really important today for the show not to really be about my perspective on things or what I've read or what I've studied, because that's not going to land. And so I'd love to hear from either Will or Evan, circling back to the question around given the current landscape, what is it like to identify as male right now, and what is it like to take care of or take responsibility for your own mental wellness?
I'll unless you want to jump in, Will, I can jump in here.
You go ahead, and I'll jump in afterwards.
Right. I guess there's a lot of sort of tacks that you could take through a question like that, just because there's so, like, it's a pretty big proportion of existing, I guess. But I think one of the things that in a modern context, one of the sort of, I don't know, we've kind of all, I think, or maybe not all, probably shouldn't say all, but a large number of people have kind of concluded that sort of Mad Men-esque 1950s dated toxic masculinity needs to go. This whole, you are self-sufficient, don't show emotion, all of that is, we can kind of agree that it's negative for everybody involved, men and women, and that it's, the faster we can ditch that, the better. But one thing that I haven't noticed is a great deal of counter messaging. Like, there isn't really an ideal if you're a dude. Sorry, I should be more formal about that. If you're somebody who identifies as male, there's not a huge. We know a great deal about things that we can do that are fairly toxic. I don't know if we have been as forthright about establishing what. I guess like a positive model of masculinity. It's like something that we can all kind of agree. And, you know, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe to an extent there was a huge problem before with trying to wedge everybody in the same narrow-minded definition of what is masculine. But I think that it's possible to have a healthy, positive concept about what being or identifying as male is without resorting to that, the same way that we have a lot of well, sorry, maybe not we have a lot of, but we're definitely improving our ability to have empowering messages about what femininity is. And as much as that, I'm not saying that that shouldn't be there, or that that's outpacing to any exterior. I'm not saying that we don't need to correct that too, but I think it'd be ideal if we could also have some of that positivity about a more modern way to act as somebody who identifies as male. Does that make any sort of sense?
That's a great point, Evan.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I love the counter messaging piece. I think that I could be wrong, but what I see out there is a lot of talk around not having to identify necessarily as anything specific, and that emotions are genderless, and almost more like a genderless take on almost like, this might be way out there, but kind of eliminating a lot of those like classic gender pieces. You see that with younger people, have more freedom. But so I guess my follow-up for you, Evan, would be, what should the counter messaging be?
That is a very difficult question, because you definitely don't want to eliminate the degree of freedom with which people can express themselves, because that's very clearly a positive development. I think at the same time, it's easier to point out that need, or it's fairly easy to point out that need in the context of, like, if you want to look at this through a political lens, most of the time, if you want to get into, you know, your sort of stereotypical, somewhat toxic Twitter exchange, one of the ways that people sort of knee-jerk response to criticisms of toxic masculinity is, well, not all men are like that, blah blah blah, they're still decent. But like, it's kind of, it's this, the conversation sort of devolves into this, okay, here's a problem with toxic masculinity, okay, but not all male identifying people are like that. No, we're not all toxic. It's more about whether or not toxic negatives exist. And I think that makes people, especially if they're less informed on the subject, feel a little bit defensive about it. I'm doing a poor job of explaining this, but I don't know if there's a real quick and easy way to determine what that positive counter messaging should be, other than maybe a little bit more open, respectful, and understanding. But like, that's almost a cop-out answer, because that's so surface level, you know? Like, you can, again, it almost comes to defining it in response to what it used to be. But I feel like any time you start to do that, it just turns into the same old point of like, oh, we shouldn't be following these toxic masculine ideals. I'm circling around because I don't really have a good answer for you, quite frankly.
I can appreciate even just being a part of the thought process that's going on for you. And yeah, I don't think it is an easy answer. Yeah, I'm kind of like, I'm not really too sure where to go with that. Either of Alex or Will want to weigh in on like what counter messaging could be around what positive counter messaging could be around identifying as a male?
Will, do you want to?
I was going to say my answer is probably not going to be any more deep than either Evan or Alex could put forth. But I think, Evan, you touched on it well, that I think a lot of guys do tend to feel attacked sometimes when, you know, things that people have been taught and that we've been taught since a young age are, you know, are questioned, and they're like, oh my goodness, like, we shouldn't be acting like this anymore. This is toxic masculinity. I think, you know, to go back to the first question a little bit before I get into like what kind of positive messaging can we have, I think to be a guy right now is a complex and confusing thing, just as it, you know, always has been. But I think even now more than ever, it's in the middle of a social revelation. I'm not quite ready to call it a revolution, but like we're having a moment of social awareness now, or wokeness, for if you want to use that term. It's confusing to be a guy who has not always been the most woke person in the room. It's hard to know where I should be, what space I should be taking up, and what words should be coming out of my mouth. You know, I think as somebody who doesn't know every single detail, I don't study social justice at school, so I'm not an academic in these topics. But I do know, and I want to take this one concept with me into everything I do now in this kind of sphere of conversation, is that, you know, my job is kind of to elevate other voices as a, you know, white cisgender heterosexual male. Like, I have pretty much every privilege there is to have, and I should be very aware of that. And so my job is to just elevate voices who haven't been listened to in the past. And I think that is probably the most important thing I can do at the moment as a guy. And I also think that involves effort from both sides of whatever debate or fight you want to call this moment that we're having, sort of. You know, there are very clearly a lot of times two sides to these debates. And I think that both sides need to put down the harsh words a lot of the time and just come together and have a conversation and see facts, use kindness, use all these kind of things. I could, use all these other synonyms for kindness and just seeing each other's point of view, but like realizing that we all have an identity that is completely valid and stuff like that. And my job is just to make sure that that conversation is being had like in a civil manner, and that people who haven't had their voices heard get to have those voices heard, get to have their identities seen. And so in terms of like what we can do to kind of have men do that more and put forward that messaging to them, I think we should just say, like, we appreciate what you guys are doing. Not every guy, guys should be taking victory laps every time they recognize somebody's gender identity or use the right pronouns or elevate somebody who hasn't had their voice heard. We don't need to take victory laps. We don't need to have our backs patted every time. But I think it's so easy to feel attacked that if you just want to take in your own time, in your private moment, or with a close friend, say, hey, I feel good that I got this person's pronouns right. I feel good that like I was able to do something good. That's okay. And I think that we need to say, thank you for making the effort. You're not done your effort yet, but we thank you guys for, seeing, being on the right side and choosing to elevate voices and choosing to recognize everybody's identity and stuff like that. So, telling men that we appreciate them for at least making an effort, I think would encourage other men to just keep going and keep pushing that effort forward. Because at the end, we all want to feel validated for our hard work.
Oh, so much good stuff in there, Will. And I can completely identify with just wanting people to be heard. My whole take, ever since the pandemic happened, and even just a lot of things happening in the States, and I don't walk around claiming to be the most woke person, but what my strategy is just to listen and just to allow people to be heard, and to always be curious, like constantly curious. And I just encourage other people to do the same, because there's a lot of people who need to be heard. And yeah, so I love that your mission is to elevate people's voices, and that's really cool. And then another thing that I heard in what you're saying is that there's almost like a pressure to be woke. Like there's this pressure to know the right pronouns, or know the right things to say, or not offend people. So what would be, so you were saying your advice around that for someone, maybe a male who isn't necessarily in on a lot of this language, or up to speed with current politics or current practices around relating to other people, because they haven't necessarily been vulnerable in a lot of their relationships, and they haven't necessarily had the ability to really experience those deep, vulnerable connections where people talk about these things. What advice would you give to a male who's
Oh, sorry, Will.
Oh, I'll just quickly say, I think that my advice would just be to come to the conversation with good intentions. I think if you use the wrong word, use the wrong pronoun, are not quite right in what you're trying to say, maybe your idea is a bit outdated, it's better to come to the conversation with what you said in there, like with a real curiosity and radical acceptance for what this person might want to tell you, not question their story, not question their lived experiences. If you want to, if you jump in and you say the wrong pronouns, just say, hey, I'm sorry, my bad, and just proceed with the conversation. It's better to be there with the right intentions and be there to support, and make a couple mistakes along the way than to withdraw yourself from the conversation, just never be there to support in the first place. Alex, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the effort goes a long way. And I think something that I have heard told to people who are not as experienced, or don't have the exposure to a lot of kind of very, very contemporary social issues, that you don't necessarily need to understand what every individual is going through, but you do have to respect it. Kind of the classic conversation for me is when I'm speaking to someone who is around like my parents' age, I would suppose. Not my parents specifically, but people of their age group. It's they really want to be progressive. Like that's a value that they carry, but they don't understand it exactly. Like they didn't have a lot of exposure to issues like like trans rights or some of the more systemic issues in race relations in Canada and the United States, and they don't quite understand it, but they really want to, and I think that makes a difference, right?
Yeah, coming to the table, just willing and open, and yeah, the desire is there to understand. Yeah.
If I can hop in on top of that too, because as Alex was saying that, I think I get what he's coming at, and in the context of this conversation on the whole, I think it's also I'd want to add that it's important to recognize. I think especially the older you are, when you learn a new thing in that field, it's tough because I think, well, it's not tough in the context, but it can be, I think, difficult for people because it means they've been doing it wrong before. And in the context of things like systemic racism, if you're doing it wrong, that means that your actions have either intentionally or unintentionally or whatever possibly caused harm. So there's a little bit of it. I think it's easier for people to it's easy for people to come into that conversation and not want to learn anything, because if they do learn anything, then oops, they did a bad before.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a realization that I had probably in my second or third year of university. And I think one of the important things that you can bring to the table, and the point that I'm trying to get to, is never assume that you know what you're doing, especially if you come from a position of privilege. I've made that mistake before, and I think one of the biggest things to take away from it is that if you don't have, it's okay. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that like if you don't know, that's a huge problem, but it's difficult to come to those conversations if you expect that you've never made a mistake, and you kind of have to be okay with the idea that you're still learning, and you have like, in order to go forward, I think you have to make peace with the fact that you may have been making mistakes up until then, and that's okay provided you try to fix it going forward.
Yeah, exactly. And to loop it back to kind of masculinity, that's an issue that comes up with a lot of fathers. Again, not mine in particular. My parents are blessings, and I love them very much. But the issue of kind of toxic masculinity is a cyclical one, where a father teaches his son that a man does X, Y, Z, and so on and so forth, and his child teaches their children, and it's difficult to kind of sit up and blink your eyes and think like, hey, the way that I was taught to act as a man is flawed, and there are things that I need to come to terms with, things that I need to recognize and address if I want to be a better person, a better man.
Well, and having that growth mindset is just something that is beneficial throughout your entire life. Like, things are always going to be evolving and changing. We're always going to be learning new things. And then when you put that in the context of a male, like you were saying, do you feel like it's harder for men to take on that growth mindset?
I think, and to kind of loop back the idea of like counter messaging into this, I think it might be, well, it might be more difficult anyway, because a large aspect of toxic masculinity is confidence, and it's a fine line to walk to be confident and not arrogant. Mm-hmm. So that might predispose you to having a little bit of a more difficult time there to begin with, but especially if the discussion is exclusively in the context of like, these are things that I've done before that I shouldn't be doing, I think that makes it even, again, easier to get your back up about it. And I think one of the interesting ways that, as a whole, we could kind of stick handle around that might be to elevate positive examples rather than just keep beating down negative ones. Like, every time that we talk about, a male figure that used to be loved but is actually now kind of like a problematic take on the way we do this, it doesn't feel great. It should happen, but it's just like, you don't celebrate it, Whereas instead, if we were talking about like modern examples of positive masculinity, that might have a lot, maybe a greater ability to resound with people and get them on board, you know?
Absolutely. And we interviewed John Ogrodnichuk from Heads Up Guys this month. Have you guys heard of Heads Up Guys?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, it's out of UBC, and he's phenomenal. He started this online platform for men. There's a self-diagnosis on there, self-check for depression. There's a stress test. There's lots of cool stuff. Remind me what you just said, Evan.
Yeah, no, it was mostly just that. I think part of, yes, the short version was, yes, I think that because of some historical elements of toxic masculinity, there is a predisposition in men to assume that you're right until conclusively proven otherwise, because you were drilled into us that we need to be confident in all circumstances, and that is easily confusable with arrogance. And I think that trying to have more positive messaging about what we should be doing, like elevating, I don't know, examples of like positive masculinity going forward, I think that might be a good way to get around that, because it's easier to celebrate a new success than it is to look at something that we used to value, like an old hero or something like that, and say, oh, well, maybe that was actually a problem. It's if it's more celebratory, I think we'll get people on board more effectively.
Thank you. And that, so the reason why I was bringing up Heads Up Guys, and also the He Changed It app, which goes live in the App Store, are because those platforms highlight stories from other men. And what they have found is that that's a great way for men to be able to relate, because a lot of men don't typically speak about their emotions or have these deep, vulnerable conversations with each other, and so they think that they're the only one. And that nobody else is feeling this way. So then when you see stories of other men, you're able to say, okay, it normalizes things, you can relate. And I like the celebratory aspect to it too, because then men can see good examples, looping back to what we were talking about positive messaging. Men can see good examples of what other guys are doing. So yeah, pretty cool. So I know that we're here tonight to talk about mental health, and we've had a really interesting discussion up until this point, and I want to hone in on and loop back to a question that I thought about prior to coming on the call tonight, and it was about how your relationships with other men. And what I'm curious is, like, do you guys talk to each other or your peers about emotions or about how you're feeling? Or is that something that is more kind of, you talk to maybe a female counterpart about that, or you don't talk about it at all?
The reason that I had Evan and Will on is because I know that these two individuals are two men that I would be very comfortable confiding in. I have multiple times for both of them. Evan is my older brother, so obviously I talk to him a lot, and Will and I have known each other way back, and so he's lent me his ear a few times, and I think that the reason men don't reach out and men have difficulty speaking with other men about personal things, personal issues, emotional issues, is because it's been ingrained into them. Like, we just keep coming back to this. Like, the body of Western masculinity has been, developed over hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so, my dad watched Clint Eastwood, right? And I watched James Bond, or any other number of movies with straight male leads, because Lord knows there's so many, that the presentation of men in the media and what is expected of men in society is that you are stoic and you can get by your own, and you're tough, and you can make it through anything on your own because you're a man and it's what you do. And so when men encounter obstacles in their mental health, um, the idea of men showing emotion, of men being sad, is frowned upon by traditional masculinity. Boys don't cry, right? And at the same time, other men don't share with other men for that exact reason. And so it's this cycle of men know they're not supposed to cry, and so, or show emotion, and so when they need to, they don't go to other men because those other men are also in on it, as it were.
Yeah, it's that whole thing around how I'm trying to raise my daughters, that emotions are genderless, and that the fact that we attach different emotions to different genders, it needs to just go away. It just
absolutely, yeah,
not be a thing. It's part of the human experience to have all of them, right? But and I can see what you're saying, where we are heavily influenced by the lens that we look through, our past experiences, what we've seen in the media and in our families and friends and communities and all that. And so the generation, my daughter's generation, she's just under 2 years old, she's going to grow up completely different. But what can we do now for men right now who know that they're suffering, and they feel like the suffering, the pain that they're feeling right now isn't as bad as the pain of being vulnerable and weak in front of someone else? What would you say, or what would you encourage someone to do?
I would say reach out. Like if you have a male identifying friend who is going through a tough time, and who you think is kind of falls victim to that aspect of hegemonic masculinity, then just to say, hey, like you seem like you're hurting, and I have time to talk. Like, what's wrong? And then just let them know that it's okay, and that they can talk about it, and they won't be looked at any differently.
Yeah. So it's almost like putting the onus on the people who are mentally well to reach out.
Not even just put onus on men to take care of their male friends. I think is what I believe.
Yeah, it's a better definition. Yeah.
Can I jump in really quickly as well?
Yeah, I was wondering how you're doing up there, Will.
Thank you.
I haven't let you get a word in.
I was gonna say, I think I've been in both shoes here. I think I've been the person who is scared to be vulnerable, and sometimes that's just vulnerability around your friends, or sometimes that's vulnerability in the sense that you're actually going to the counselors or the therapists, or whoever, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're going to. I've been that vulnerable. I've also been I have experienced that, like that resistance to being vulnerable before, that it's so scary and that like I don't need this help, I'm okay. And I've also experienced the like going to every single one of my friends and telling them what's wrong and being really open about my mental health and being like, yeah, I want to go back to counseling right now, like I'm ready. So it's really hard sometimes. I can totally identify with that, like real, like willing, like this desire to not even admit that you have the problem in the first place. When I was younger, I went to counseling for like a couple years, and then I stopped, and then my mental health got bad again, and I was like so resistant to going back. I was like, if I like admit that I have a problem again, like I'm back where I was. I'm back at square one. Like I just don't want to be vulnerable again. Like I am like, I'd rather put the Band-Aid over it and just keep going with my life. But ultimately, it just took, I think there's a saying like 3 seconds of courage or something like that. It ultimately took 3 seconds of courage to admit to my mom again that I was going through a bad phase of my mental health, And I was back in the counselor's office, however much I was scared to be there. I didn't really want to be there. And, you know, now years later, I'm better than I ever have been. And I've gone in and out of counseling many times since then. And every time it's hard to go back, but you just need a couple seconds of courage to admit to one person that you're having a hard time, no matter who that person is. If they really care about you, they're going to try and get you to do the right thing, whether that's, you know, just talking to them or talking to family members, going to see professional counseling, getting medication, whatever that happens to be. Take a couple seconds of courage is all you need to be vulnerable to one person, and that can totally change the entire trajectory of your life. So to men who are like really feeling that pain, I would just say take one gamble. All it has to be is like a couple seconds with somebody you really trust, and that could really change everything for you.
So good. Why do you think it is that talk therapy is just not a desirable thing for guys to do?
I think they have no practice with it. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
When
Go ahead.
men aren't sorry if I cut you off, Will. When
Don't
men
worry about it.
aren't taught to communicate their feelings, they don't develop the tools to do it, and so they're at a disadvantage from the first place, right? Like, yeah, it's not something that men are taught to do. Like I can't speak for women, and I want to make that very clear, but like the way that I assume women are kind of conditioned to speak about their feelings in a more open way.
And if I can hop in on top of that, the sort of corollary of that point is going to be that if a dude does reach out in particular, well, I guess to one of his male friends who are operating on that premise, then the level of support that you receive because of all of this is far more likely to be lacking. Which means that I think he'd probably be less likely to do it again. So it kind of ends up being the circumstance where even if the person who needs help reaches out, there's a good chance they're not going to get it, despite being that vulnerable, unless they go through like a professional or actual healthcare route with it.
Sorry, the person that reaches out is likely not going to get what they need?
Well, sorry, if we are operating under the pretense that men do not receive the same level of sort of natural, societally ingrained training in how to support their male peers because we don't do that, then we're going to be bad at it because we don't have any practice, and those are learned skills. So as a result, if somebody decides to break the mold, they're going to have probably on average less success, which is going to further hamper it's a positive feedback loop is what I'm getting at.
For sure, 100%.
Yeah. So what have you guys found that works when you're trying to connect with other men? What works?
I think that being vulnerable works, like being very, very obviously vulnerable works in that they feel comfortable reflecting that vulnerability, making sure that they understand it's a safe space, I think. You know, the classic telling one of your male friends about something negative you went through, they always respond with just like, it sucks.
Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah. And so when avoiding that, when one of your male friends comes to you and says, you know, my girlfriend broke up with me, I'm failing this class, any multitude of things, just like sit down and look them in the eye and say like, hey, I'm really sorry. Like, is there anything that makes you feel better? Like, do you want to talk about it? Like, where are your feelings coming from? Blah, blah, blah. Like actually sitting down and addressing their emotions instead of just going like, oh yeah, man, sucks.
Yeah, like these relationships, they require effort. But then there's also the compassion and the curiosity piece too. If you can just be a listener and ask insightful questions, and just hold a safe space for people. So avoiding just the closed off, oh, it sucks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it
Way
good?
she goes.
And like that's a really funny way to put it, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that active listening, which is I think the like or active listening or other such related ways to be there for people are not something that is necessarily obvious. I don't think, especially if you come from an upbringing where I don't know, you're the idea of you as a dude showing emotion is or recognizing that emotion exists is frowned upon. Like just getting to the point where you can have somebody feel like they can open up to you by listening to what they're saying actively and engaging with it. That's something that I would hesitate to. I think you'd even benefit from getting like most guys would benefit from getting formal training in. Like that's not something that comes naturally, especially depending on where you come from.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I might point out too is it might be, especially as a stopgap measure in the interim, more effective to just really make more public resources available. You know, things like uh, counseling services, crisis hotlines, places where men can reach out where those skills are necessarily there.
And that's what John from Heads Up Guy, that's the advice that he gave us too, is just the reason why this website is one of the most successful men's health websites in North America is because it's directed at men and directed at depression, and it's anonymous, and you can be self-sufficient by looking it up. So it's fulfilling your inherently male disposition to have to be self-sufficient and do things on your own and figure things out and fix things on your own. Well, doing a Google search, you're figuring it out, you're learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
The same thing with this app, the He Changed It app. You have the ability to speak with people on the app anonymously, so you don't even have to give your name or anything. And they're finding that that's really working with men too, is just removing as many barriers as possible for people to be able to have the resources and not be hesitant to access the resources. We had a conversation earlier on in the month with an awesome guy, Brad Robinson. He has founded The Complete Athlete. He was a male firefighter for 18 years and got to the point where his PTSD was so bad and he was so depressed that he wasn't able to contain his emotions anymore. He used to be able to hold them in until he finished his shift, then he'd get to his truck and then he'd let it out and cry. And then he got to the point where he was at work and he couldn't cap it down anymore. And I think it's really interesting to talk about that moment where it's that rock bottom, things are so bad moment where some men go one way and then it's tragic, but a lot of men go the other way, right? And so what he said is they're right in front of him, touching on what you guys are saying about resources. There was a wall and it had cards on it, and there was a card with a number if you need help. And he just grabbed the card and he went into the other room on his shift and he just dialed the phone number. Mm-hmm. But if that card wasn't right in front of his face, you know, what would have happened? Like, what would have the rest of the day looked like for him, right? And so you think about like how important it is for guys to just have resources, whether it's the relationships that they have with their buddies or relationships that they have with the females, or being able to just, have access to an app on their phone. So, you did touch on how that is. Can you guys keep hearing the dinging of my emails? I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I don't know how to turn that off. Let's just see where we're at for time. Okay, so in respect to your guys' time, and I want to say thank you. We're so grateful on behalf of Third Space that you guys were here with us tonight. I'd love to just open the floor. If there's anything that's left unsaid that you want to share, here's the space to do that.
Yeah, I have two things I'd want to leave off with really quickly.
Yes,
The
please.
first one, I was looking for a space to jump in that last little conversation, but I couldn't quite find it. But I did want to give like my one hack for good like one-on-one conversations, especially when it comes to somebody confiding in you. This is part of my residence advisor, like RA stuff at school when I was supporting first years in residence. If somebody comes to you with a problem and they are fired up, angry, upset, heartbroken, whatever it happens to be, it's really super helpful in those interactions to match their energy level with yours. So if they come in fired up with something, come in fired up about it as well. Maybe within like one or two, if like you want to put it on a scale of 10, come in like 1 or 2 spots within them. So if they're really fired up, like an 8, come in like a 7 or a 6, right? Match them. If they're really sad about a breakup and they just want to like yell in the car for a bit, like be there with them. But if they come in really sad about something at an energy level like 2, don't be up here at an 8, like yelling at them to like get fired up. It's not what you want to do. It doesn't help. So if you're a guy, you have no idea how to manage your friend who's come to you with a breakup and he's super sad, energy level of a 2, come in at a 2 as well, whatever that means to you. And I guarantee that conversation will go a little bit better.
Such a good step. I've never heard, I haven't heard that one. I think naturally I do that as a coach, but I don't think I really put strategy around it. So that's really cool.
Yeah. Sometimes it helps to explicitly hear those kind of like tips we all kind of do sometimes, but now you can consciously do it, and it does help a lot, I find. My last thing really quickly is that if you feel like if you are depressed or anxious and have kind of not even a diagnosed disorder like that, sometimes I learned this in my psychology class. My professor was telling us about his own personal experiences with anxiety and depression. And he was saying sometimes you just have to go to the medication, and that is okay. I think for a lot of my time dealing with mental health, I pushed away medication. And then finally, when COVID-19 came around, my mental health got really bad again. And I finally said that now is the time I need to do this, because seeing counselors in person, that kind of stuff is not really feasible. And so I started the medication, and it has really, really helped me, and it's really made a difference in my own personal life. So if you're somebody who's really struggling right now, counseling isn't quite doing it for you right now at the moment with like COVID and stuff like that, and you have that kind of resource available to you in a safe, controlled way, I would encourage you to take advantage of it if it's something you're comfortable with, because it has really, in my own personal experience, turned things around. I think that it's done that for other people as well. So I don't think there's a ton to lose necessarily by giving it a try. So I know I was really resistant to it in the past, and I regret that resistance. And so I just hope other people don't make that same mistake that I did. I took up a lot of time there. So Alex, Evan, if you have something else.
No,
that was great, Will.
That's so good. I love that you're just advocating for that, because you hear a lot of it on the other side. So it's nice to just hear someone who's having a positive experience with that and being open enough to share that. That's great. Thanks, Will. That's awesome. And I know you have so much experience on campus, and you're living on campus in Vancouver right now. And a part of the show that we didn't get to was all about the impact of COVID on students and their studies. And so I'm proposing to you to maybe do another round and maybe do another show just specifically on that. If you're open, I'd love to be able to dive into that stuff.
I would absolutely love that. I'd be totally happy to talk to you again. And I really appreciate you giving me the platform to talk today.
Oh, so good. Awesome. What about you two? What about the brothers?
I just think that if to take anything away from this is, if you are a male identifying individual and you either find yourself in a place where you're struggling or you see someone else struggling, don't be afraid to give or receive help.
Yeah, I think the only, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I was just going to say, it sounds so succinct and so simple. And it's sad that it is a fear.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy for your voice, that you were able to just, other dudes that are your age are going to see this and be like, oh, okay. So thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I think I can really add to all of that are those, pretty good points, is I think there's a real tendency to trivialize the complexity involved with being there for somebody, especially for men, but just in general. And especially since this is something that's sort of targeted towards students, most students are within their network somewhere going to have somebody who has a degree of formal training in how to help people through crisis. So RAs being the big one, firstly, but campus resources, all of that kind of a thing. And if you are looking to become an advocate for mental health in general, men's mental health in particular, I think that that kind of training is something that is invaluable. And if you feel comfortable with it, sitting down with those individuals and just learning the skills and picking their brain of how to actually support your friends in crisis, I think is something that's probably undervalued, because those skills are not trivial, they are not innate, and they need to be developed.
I'm just writing this down, Evan. And that almost could be a sequel of another show. It's how to support your friends in crisis. That's really good. Would you guys be open to diving into that at some point?
Yeah.
I would love to, yeah.
That might be an interesting, another interesting conversation. So, oh, such good stuff. My brain, the wheels are turning, and I'm just grateful that you guys were able to hop on the call with me tonight. And I can guarantee that if you guys are willing, the Third Space platform is going to see more of you. So with that said, have the best night ever. And yeah, be well and stay safe.
Thanks, you too. And thank you so much for having us on.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.